Hi, BookTube, and welcome to this Middlemarch Meditations and this sunny, leafy photograph that has something to do with the chapter we're going to cover. But it's really more of a tactic to cheer myself because here in the United Kingdom, Storm Henk has left the country with, I think, about 127 different flood alerts, and we have not seen much of the sun. Back in 1989, when we bought our flat, I didn't even think about, am I buying it in the east of the country or the west of the country? Am I buying this property that's on high ground or low ground? Am I close to a river or not? None of that mattered in the late 80s. So the fact that I still have dry floors right now or dry possessions, well, that's more down to luck than judgment. Let's get started with chapter 7. I'm going to be honest. I thought this chapter would either be set on the day of Dorothea's wedding to Mr. Casaubon or shortly after. So I was surprised to find that we were still in their courtship period. You know, what more is there? As I kept on reading, it seemed to me, given what I know about the book, so I don't know where I'm going with this. It is what's the word, tabula rasa for me, whereas, the rest of you may have read it before. So I don't know what's coming. I'm taking it that this chapter is kind of bringing together information about the respective personalities of Dorothea Brooke and Mr. Casaubon that we already know if we were to pick around and pull out various quotes, earlier indications. But we've not had the effect of kind of setting them out side by side, which this chapter does, which just kind of emphasizes exactly where their problems are going to be later on. And so we start with chapter 7, the epigram. Look, I studied French, I studied Spanish. I could probably try to read Italian, but there's subtle differences in the phonetics of those romantic languages, and I would just hate to murder a language as beautiful as Italian. Can we just leave the text? If you do know Italian, please feel free to say it, or record it out loud somewhere, and then there's something beautiful that exists in the universe. But it's not going to be beautiful if I read it. I'm going to give you the English translation. It is pleasure and melons. There you go. See, there's the link to the photograph. Pleasure and melons need the same weather. Odd thing to start a chapter with. Eliot, it comes out of left field sometimes, whereas so many of her other epigrams have dealt with religion or philosophy. And I suppose there's philosophy in this. This is a folk proverb. And it's talking about the conditions needed for growing melons. And you'll see I made a lovely note because I am not a gardener. Let's just establish that right now. I have never grown anything. Well, no, that's not true. In school, you had to do radish seeds. Yeah. I mean, that doesn't count as anything. But there we go. I managed that. I did get a radish to grow. Melons need, according to my notes, a consistent temperature between 18 to 21 centigrade, which I would love to experience right now myself. And that's 64 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, because I know I've got viewers on the other side of the Atlantic. So we'll just make sure we're fair and get both. But melons need a lot of care. I had no idea. I love a bit of online research. I think you probably like a little of the benefit of my online research. Let me just scroll down here to these lovely notes I took about growing melons. Start them off indoors around April. You plant 1 to 2 seeds per pot. You keep a consistent temperature between 18 to 21 centigrade or 64 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If more than one seed sprouts, remove the weaker one so that you have only one plant per pot. Interesting. Okay. When you come to move them outdoors, be sure there is temperature consistency. If there's a much lower temperature outdoors, that could kill the plant. The maturing plant is going to need a container at least 18 inches wide and 18 inches deep, with an additional 18 inches between one plant and another. The planting site should be warm, sunny, and sheltered. The soil should be warmed ahead of transplanting by covering it with a cloche. So you really are, I just get this picture of warmth, 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 warmth. And then it goes on to say, melons need regular attention, not just consistent warmth, but frequent watering and feeding. And when melon plants are in flower, you have to make sure that they get attention from pollinators. So they must take a lot of patience and perseverance to get right, because it's obvious that you can't just let melons get on their own. unless you happen to live in some magical landscape, which just happens to give them the correct conditions all the time. It looks to me like you constantly have to be worrying. And I did see a photograph on Google with a temperature gauge stuck in the soil beside a patch of melons. And I thought, oh my goodness, there's some gardener that heads out there every day to check to see that the temperature of the soil that the melons are in hasn't got too cold. And I thought, wow, okay, so dedication is required. I think you really have to love melons. So it's interesting that Elliot should choose them. I don't know if she grew them, but obviously she must have at least known what I now know from Google, that they're not going to be the kind of plants that maybe a beginner should attempt to deal with. So that's interesting. On that note, we will go back now to page 63. There we go. We've moved the page up now, and we'll just begin reading. Mr. Casaubon, as might be expected, spent a great deal of his time at the Grange in these weeks. Okay, so I guess this chapter is going to summarize what happened in the 6 weeks of their courtship. And the hindrance, the harsh words that are used here. You know, this is a time when if you were a normal couple, you would use only lovely, pretty words to describe what you did to spend time together. But we're using the word hindrance. And the hindrance which courtship occasioned to the progress of his great work, the key to all mythologies, naturally made him look forward the more eagerly to the happy termination. Another lovely word. I put it in pink because it made me think of, people being made redundant, losing their jobs. Cut. More cutting words, but in a different sense with Mr. Casaubon. The happy termination of courtship. But he had deliberately incurred the hindrance. There we go, having made up his mind that it was now time for him to adorn his life with the graces of female companionship. I'm going to stop there because I want to go back to what I highlighted in yellow and I think another color there. His great work, The Key to All Mythologies. I've discovered a really interesting book called The World of Mr. Casaubon by Colin Kidd. It's stupidly expensive. It's one of those academic books that I wish they would price in a way that was more accessible. I wish they would try to reach out to a broader audience instead of creating this idea that somehow your work won't be valued for what... I'm not sure where the tension is there, but they make the book so exclusive and so difficult to get. And I would be very interested in knowing this. But apparently from I'd say the 17th century onward, there has been a consistent scholarly interest in England in this business of mythography, that is trying to map out mythologies and make sense of them. And I do know about, is it Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough? I didn't look that up before I made these notes, but I have read parts of The Golden Bough. Of course, I've read a fair bit of Joseph Campbell, but he's much later. He's, mid-20th century. In Colin Kidd's book, he's talking about sort of 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So this great work that Mr. Casaubon is doing, it wouldn't have been an unusual study in a sense, but not many men did it. But because it's a huge thing to undertake. So I suppose sympathy for him. He wasn't doing something completely unattempted by anyone before. He was simply having a slightly different attempt, because most of these attempts tried to come to some unifying statement about all mythologies across all religions worldwide, and they all don't. as we could probably guess, right? Most of my listeners, I think, are pretty intelligent, and they already know that's a lost cause. Yeah, a lost cause. Yeah. Let's go back to where we finished off. We talked about the graces of female companionship to irradiate the gloom which fatigue was apt to hang over the intervals of studious labour, with the play of female fancy, and to secure in this his culminating age, the solace of female tendance for his declining years. Oh, well, wow, I've married my nurse, and he might as well have got a dog, except a dog wouldn't have been able to do perhaps some of the things that a woman could do as far as nursing him in his old age. But basically, he wants a companion. A dog would have been better. He wants a dog and a nurse. A dog and a nurse, and he'd have been fine. And now here's where it gets really cool. Hence, he determined, because, when one is in love, you have to kind of make up your mind to be affectionate, don't you? No, you don't. No, you don't. Not if you're really. You can barely stop it. But he had to determine to abandon himself to the stream of feeling. Oh, my goodness. Is that like when you approach a cold lake on vacation and you think, oh my goodness, it's really cold, but I'm going to jump in. If I do it really fast, maybe I won't notice you. I don't know. But it obviously was a big decision for him to do this. It's quite a new thing, oddly. In other words, he hasn't just fallen into it already, which one would have thought if someone were in love. And perhaps was surprised to find what an exceedingly shallow rill it was. Okay, this is saying something now about Casaubon. Just what kind of emotional reservoir has he got for other people? So it says, perhaps was surprised to find what an exceedingly shallow rill it was, as in droughty regions, baptism by immersion could only be performed symbolically. So Mr. Casaubon found that sprinkling was the utmost approach to a plunge which his stream would afford him. There's also and I've underlined these because the business of streaming and his stream and sprinkling, I'm very sorry everyone, but I don't know how George Eliot was not called out for the sexual subtext of her writing, because immediately all I could think of as I kept on going, it said, and he concluded that the poets had much exaggerated the force of masculine passion. And I thought, how was she not called out for this? How were there not reviews calling her indecent and lewd? And because this is the 19th century, now we just kind of go, it's just a mild joke to us. But in the 19th century, this is just utterly scandalous. So I don't know who read over this and completely failed to see that along with talking about Mr. Casaubon's emotional state, it did to me seem that we're also commenting on his libido and the natural physical reactions that one would expect. So that's what I'm saying. To me, it sounds, it just jumps off the page, and I'm surprised that she got away with it. But perhaps that's me with my 21st century mind, which is perhaps a little bit more tuned than other readers, and certainly 19th century readers might be. They wouldn't be looking for that kind of thing, would they? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But I cannot resist the conviction that George Eliot knew exactly what she was writing. But, I'm allowed to have opinions on the Meditations. You don't have to believe them, but I'm allowed to have them. Okay. So he said, nevertheless, he observed with pleasure. Okay, so he finds some source of pleasure. What is it? That Miss Brooke showed an ardent, submissive affection. Yeah, that's what it really wants power. It gets pleasure from the power of having somebody immediately recognize what the pecking order is and fall right into it. Yeah, that gives him pleasure. Yeah, well, he needs a dog and a nurse, and I mean, you want a dog to do what you tell them, and you want a nurse to be there when you need them, right? You don't want a nurse to go wandering off and have a life of his or her own, would you? No, absolutely not. What would be the point of them nursing you then? To fulfill his most agreeable previsions of marriage. I wonder what he has imagined marriage to be like. I wonder if he has imagined anything approaching actual marriage. We're just going to move the screen up now. And here, you've got to love this passage. It had, once or twice, crossed his mind that possibly there was some deficiency in Dorothea to account for the moderation of his abandonment. Like she's not nearly desirable enough. But he was unable to discern the deficiency. Oh, thank goodness. Or to figure to himself a woman who would have pleased him better. Yeah, which there are other suspicions to me, when I read this with a 21st century mind, and I don't think that Eliot would have necessarily been doing this. I could perceive that there's a possibility that Mr. Casaubon isn't actually attracted to women, but is perhaps, well, we talk about people being in denial or being in the closet, but I think in the 19th century it was possible to be even further back than that. I think it was possible to simply not have a conception of anything, that there was only one way to be. The lack of feeling could also indicate asexuality, that he simply wasn't interested in sex. And it wouldn't, of course, become a problem while he was a clergyman. And to be honest, in the 19th century, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem for a married man. Not necessarily, unless he needed an heir. Then it might be a little bit of a problem. But there were ways around those kind of things. There absolutely were. I suddenly think of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. There are always ways around things. But that, again, is a 20th century novel, post First World War, when already ideas were happening. Yeah. In the 19th century, though, I think it would be possible for Mr. Casaubon to be not to be self-aware sexually, and so that he is doing this. He's trying to understand why he has about this much feeling for Dorothea, which is, it's not even a puddle, and he's trying to figure out, well, maybe it's Dorothea that has a problem. It doesn't even occur to him. He hasn't got the vocabulary or the idea constructs to begin to turn the issue back on himself and go, well, hang on, what do I really feel about my sexuality? Not even sure if the word sexuality. Here's where I used to have access online to the Oxford English Dictionary, and the one brilliant thing about it was that you could look up when did they find the earliest usage of a word in print, and that doesn't necessarily pinpoint when it started to be used overall, but you know that it probably didn't age much before that time. That when it starts appearing in print, generally you can figure that it was in use perhaps a bit before that, but not a lot before that. And I just wonder if even the word sexuality, certainly the word sexual identity, was just, that whole phrase was simply, but what? There was man and there was woman. What, there was still, I still think the book of Genesis pretty much in England decided how you viewed sexuality. So you viewed it with a bit of suspicion anyway, but you needed it to reproduce. End of. But there certainly wouldn't have been any way that Mr. Casaubon could have turned this problem into himself and asked any intelligent questions about why his stream of feeling was not a stream, but possibly, a few bits in an eyedropper. I don't know. He couldn't have found that out, unfortunately, and because he's a man. Again, 19th century cultural expectations are the man does not need to ask any questions about himself. Right? Henry VIII did not ask, what's wrong with me, when his wives could not give him sons. No, absolutely not. And for many centuries after that, it was never asked of the man. There wasn't the understanding. It's so easy to forget what we didn't know, what we literally had no concept of. Nobody was even taking a guess in that direction. And this is true for Mr. Casaubon. Couldn't even take a guess in that direction. And I'm not entirely sure that Eliot could. So although she's describing him, and although I'm laughing because I can see sexual subtext in the lines, I would be careful about saying that she was trying to show the reader that Mr. Casaubon was asexual. She wouldn't have had that, I don't even think, the concept of the possibility of, if that makes sense. We have learned that. So I would just leave it that she's just saying, this man does not have a lot of emotional stuff to bring. He is not. If Dorothea is a melon patch, and I think that's what the whole epigram is dealing with here. If Dorothea is a melon patch, then Mr. Casaubon is a gardener with no source of water or food, and he's cold. So how successful do you think he'll be as a melon tender? Simple as. I think that's as far as she's going. Now we go down to the bottom of the page where we see Dorothea speaking to Mr. Casaubon and asking, could I not be preparing myself now to be more useful? She asked this early in the time of courtship. Could I not learn to read Latin and Greek aloud to you, as Milton's daughters did to their father without understanding what they read? I tried online to find out more about Milton's daughters, and I probably would need to spend money on some biographies to get more information. I certainly understood that they hated reading to Milton, and that their relationship with their father was a very, very difficult one. And for that reason, we can go on to the next page, because we'll see that Casaubon is aware of that. Maybe he knew more than I'm able to get off Google. Okay, so here we've got the text on screen now. I'm sorry that this photo came out a little blurred on top. So Casaubon says, I fear that would be wearisome, and he reminds her, he said, the young women you have mentioned, Milton's daughters, regarded that exercise in unknown tongues as a ground for rebellion against the poet. Now, it's interesting, though, because he uses the word rebellion, and she counters. So, in other words, what's being set up here is Casaubon is saying, you might rebel against me. And Dorothea trying to make herself different from Milton's daughters, saying, yes, but in the first place, they were very naughty girls. Naughty, of course, meant more than it does now. Now it almost means just like a child's mischief. but then I think it could really be used as a synonym for delinquent. It was a much worse. They would have, else they would have been proud to minister to such a father. And in the second place, they might have studied privately and taught themselves to understand what they read. And then it would have been interesting. I hope you don't expect me to be naughty and stupid. And I don't know, maybe I should have underlined that, because maybe we will find those words at some point appearing when they're married. Naughty and stupid. I don't know. It's sometimes wonderful. See it again, but we'll find out. At any rate, of course, Casaubon says, I expect you to be all that an exquisite young lady can be in every possible relation of life. Certainly it might be a great advantage if you were able to copy the Greek character, and to that end it were well to begin with a little reading. So here is their courtship. Their courtship consists of Dorothea being taught to read and write, copy Greek. And by reading and writing, I know what she means, because when I learned French, the first thing we learned was the alphabet and how to pronounce all the vowels and so on, so that I could look at any word in French, even a sentence in French, and I could correctly read it, pronounce it. And if it was read to me, I could correctly spell it out. But if you said, what have you just written out? I'd go, I don't know. I haven't learned. We learned the meanings of the words and vocabulary separately. But the first thing we learned was how to correctly pronounce all the letters and recognize the sounds. So we knew all the different sounds that the vowel E can make, and to be able to try to recognize them. So we put the correct accent on the E when we were taking dictation. So in a sense, she's doing the same thing here, I presume, with Greek. She's learning the alphabet, and then she's learning what sounds, when she hears them, correspond to what characters. So I presume that she can either then, he can read to her and she can copy it down. I'm not sure what he's hoping she'll be able to do, but certainly it doesn't yet involve understanding. But Dorothea, because she is literally waiting on tenterhooks, and this is of course the difference between Casaubon, whose capacity to get excited about doing the whole marriage thing is limited. By contrast, Dorothea is she's just sitting there like a little ball of energy waiting. So it says she seized this as a precious permission. Now that is interesting, a precious permission, implying that she's not experiencing much in the way of permission otherwise. That, Casaubon is not otherwise sort of open to other things. And we'll see this as we read the paragraph. So it says, she would not have asked Mr. Casaubon at once to teach her the languages, dreading of all things to be tiresome instead of helpful, but it was not entirely out of devotion to her future husband that she wished to know Latin and Greek. Okay, this is interesting. So there is a subversiveness going on here. Those provinces of masculine knowledge, oh my God, yeah, those must have seemed like those little unattainable, like Prometheus stealing fire. Yeah, those provinces of masculine knowledge seemed to her a standing ground from which all truth could be seen more truly. From her point of view, men have just got a bit of insight that women can't get, and that's because certain areas of knowledge women are never quite allowed to dig their way into. So she's hoping that Latin and Greek will do it. It'll kind of be the great key of David that unlocks. I'm using a phrase that only some people are going to understand, but a key, just a key. Think of a key, right? You get a key, you can unlock a door. If you don't have a key, you stay on the other side of the door. You never know what's beyond. As it was, she constantly doubted her own conclusions because she felt her own ignorance. How could she be confident that one-roomed cottages were not for the glory of God, when men who knew the classics appeared to conciliate indifference to the cottages with zeal for the glory? Okay, that's it. It appeared to conciliate indifference to the cottages with zeal for the glory. So I'm rereading it again because I want to be sure that I absolutely understand. But it's obvious that this goes back to the conversation that she must have had with Casaubon about the cottages and his complete lack of interest in it. And she's now taking that to mean that maybe she doesn't really know what constitutes Christianity, because there she is just feeling, wanting to do something kind and practical for people's needs. And yet here was this man who knows Greek and Hebrew and Latin, and he just doesn't even have the time of day for this cottages business. So what does he know? What does he know? And can she unlock it by learning these languages. It sounds bizarre to us. It's like, what do you think is going to come? We don't even know those 3 languages. I don't know those 3 languages, but I feel fairly confident. It's like you won't be unlocking a great deal. Perhaps even Hebrew might be necessary. Oh, I love it. Yeah, let's get as many languages as we can. That should sort it out. At least the alphabet and a few roots in order to arrive at the core of things. Yeah, that's what we need. Yeah, Hebrew will do it. You'll suddenly know the great core of things, and judge soundly on the social duties of a Christian. In other words, the only way to make sound judgment on what your duty is as a Christian is to know at least 4 languages, which puts many of us at a distinct disadvantage. We haven't got a hope. I say this tongue in cheek, right? I say this tongue in cheek. And she had not reached that point of renunciation at which she would have been satisfied with having a wise husband. She wished, poor child, to be wise herself. Miss Brooke was certainly very naive with all her alleged cleverness. Celia, here we go, we'll bring Celia in just a contrast, whose mind had never been thought too powerful. Sorry, Celia. Saw the emptiness of other people's pretensions much more readily. To have in general but little feeling seems to be the only security against feeling too much on any particular occasion. But again, it's sort of stating who's the person with the most, who's got the deepest emotional pool here, who's got the greatest emotional heat out of these 2. Dorothea. There's such a big contrast, and now might be a good time to stop just here and go back to bits of the book that we've already read and just contrast Dorothea's passionate nature. How often has it been talked about, and how often has Mr. Casaubon's emotional coldness been talked about? So if we go back, we can see evidence now for Dorothea first to claims that have already been made in the text for her passionate nature. 1, we have on page 8 the hereditary strain of Puritan energy, which means that normal religious feeling is compounded to, and I'm quoting, eccentric agitation. And then 2, we've got the pagan sensuous way that Dorothea used to enjoy riding horses. Do you remember that was from page 9. She allowed herself that, but she was already having doubts whether that was a good thing or not. 3, we have Dorothea's reaction to seeing her mother's emerald bracelet, something about those gemstones, because they are considered sometimes more valuable than diamonds. They're certainly more fragile than diamonds. And her reaction to those stones, which have so much symbolism tied up with them. 4, we've got on pages 27 to 28, the visions of the future that she has when she goes out walking, when she's at a point where she thinks Mr. Casaubon might be interested in her. And she's just all like this, and she has to go out walking. 5, how rude she can be when things are not going the way she wants, how moody and tearful. And you remember what happened when Celia confronted her about what she was actually doing to Sir James by, letting him go ahead and build these cottages without realizing, what was he really doing. And remember, her reaction was very emotional, very childish. I think Celia felt a little bit sort of like, okay, getting a bit carried away there. Then, of course, we've got 6, her, quote, electric reaction to hearing that she has received a letter from Casaubon. That's from page 37. And then 7, her reaction after reading the letter on page 44. She trembles, she falls on her knees, she weeps, she loses track of time. Even though that letter had all the passion of, I don't know, your average job advert. It was a contract, not a love letter. And yet we saw how, how much emotion came forth just from that not very exciting letter. And then 8, of course, we'll see, now this is coming up. We're on page 64 now. We need to get to page 66 to capture this last point. But this last point is that on page 66, she talks about her reaction to just hearing a pipe organ played in a cathedral. Right? Okay, so that's the evidence of that. Now, perhaps what we do, we'll stop there. We'll just cover those points about Dorothea. We'll carry on with page 65 and to 66. And when we reach the point number 8 that I made about the organ playing in the cathedral, then we'll pick up and talk about Mr. Casaubon. So we get to the bottom of here, and of course, it's just describing how Mr. Casaubon consented to teach her for an hour altogether, and he treated her like a schoolmaster would, and so on. And now I'm going to take away page 64. I'm going to put up page 65. Bear with me while I just get that here, and we'll try and stretch that a little. There we go. Okay, bring it down so we can see the top of the page. There we go. And she's talking about how Dorothea is initially, when she has these lessons, shocked and discouraged by her own stupidity and the answers she got to some timid questions about the value of the Greek accents gave her a painful suspicion that here indeed there might be secrets not capable of explanation to a woman's reason. I think she's going to think something different in a few chapters' time, but we'll leave that. Now, we suddenly bring Mr. Brooke back in, because of course all this is happening at Tipton. So Mr. Brooke is witnessing it all. Mr. Brooke had no doubt on that point and expressed himself with his usual strength upon it one day that he came into the library while the reading was going forward. And he says, "Well, but now, Casaubon, such deep studies, classics, mathematics, that kind of thing, are too taxing for a woman, too taxing, you know." And Mr. Casaubon evades the question, so he's as good as Dorothea at that. "Dorothea is learning to read the characters simply," said Mr. Casaubon, evading the question. "She has the very considerate thought of saving my eyes." "Ah, well, without understanding, you know, that may not be so bad. But there is a lightness about the feminine mind, a touch and go. Music, the fine arts, that kind of thing, they should study those up to a certain point. Women should, but in a light way." Now that is condemning himself, and I think I put a note up here. Yeah, oh my God, Mr. Brooke condemns himself, because when he describes how women should study, that's exactly what he does. Mr. Brooke approaches all subjects in the way he's advising that women should. Interesting. Very interesting. I was quite taken aback by that, because I thought, well, he's not, he's a man, but he's not giving it any more effort. He's used that phrase up to a certain point. He used it at the dinner party way back at the beginning of the book to talk about how he'd got into things. He took things up to a certain point and then he backed off. So I don't know if he's really saying, oh, women can't do it, or is he more worried that Dorothea can handle this, and what is it going to make him look like? What is it going to make him look like if she can cope with greater academic depth than he can? So again, he goes on to say, "A woman should be able to sit down and play you or sing you a good old English tune. That is what I like. Though I have heard most things. I have been at the opera in Vienna, of course. He's done so many things. He's done everything of that sort, of course, he has. But I'm a conservative in music." That's suggesting, as I say in my note, that he might be liberal in other areas. And of course, he's hinted that politically he's more liberal. He says, "I stick to the good old tunes." Now, of course, then follows a conversation. I think it's neither here nor there, really, because both Mr. Casaubon and Dorothea, they don't have a great deal of time for what would have been popular music then. Little light pieces to play on the piano, possibly to sing to. The sort of thing that, of course, Celia does, as Mr. Brooke says. "Ah, there you are." We go down to the paragraph here. "Ah, there you are behind Celia. My dear Celia now plays very prettily and is always ready to play. However, since Casaubon does not like it, you are all right. But it's a pity you should not have little recreations of that sort." And Mr. Casaubon ends by saying music is just not going to suffice for recreation. I don't think there's anything here I want to really light on. I'm going to go straight on to page 66 and put that up quickly for you. I say quickly as I am known to be, which isn't very quick. And we'll just, put that up here. And again, so we're still talking about music, so you can tell that we're going to get to this point. "As to the grander forms of music," there we go, here's Mr. Casaubon saying, "worthy to accompany solemn celebration, and even to serve as an educating influence according to the ancient conception, I say nothing, for with these we are not immediately concerned. However, well, Dorothea is, because she says, 'No, but music of that sort I should enjoy,' said Dorothea. 'When we were coming home from Lausanne, my uncle took us to hear the great organ at Freiburg, and it made me sob. Well, I know I shouldn't say this because I love the music of cathedral-sized pipe organs. They're amazing. and there's something about that sound which just goes right through your body and probably gets all your vital organs vibrating. And I'm sure, yes, it is emotionally affecting. And for someone like Dorothea, I'm sure she would just completely break down in tears. But even if you don't cry, your whole body feels that sound, definitely. And of course, then her uncle finds another reason to find fault with her. He says, "That kind of thing is not healthy, my dear," said Mr. Brooke. "Casaubon, she will be in your hands now. You must teach my niece to take things more quietly. Eh, Dorothea?" That line I underlined because I thought, well, if she was going to learn from anyone, she would learn from Casaubon, because we have seen, as he's been introduced throughout the novel so far, we've seen evidence of incredible amounts of an emotional coldness and withdrawal from the interactions where we normally need emotions with each other. So, for example, if we go back to page 18, when he was at dinner, he admitted to an interest in the past and dead things, and he isn't easily drawn into the conversation that's happening right there and then with living people around the table. 2, he doesn't make small talk, right? Page 33 says if he can't speak about his work, he's silent, right? 3, and this is page 22, and this is, of course, one of those phrases that we underlined a great deal, because he said, "We must keep the germinating grain away from the light." He's not a person inclined to worry about people's growth, And since we're talking about, the conditions for the growth of Melons, and that is just a metaphor for the right conditions for the growth of Dorothea, we've got a serious problem here coming, that we've got a plant that is not going to thrive, right? If we talk about Dorothea in terms of garden vegetables, garden produce. A 5, or 4 rather, he had a smile like pale wintry sunshine. That was Celia's view of him on page 26. 5, he had no interest in Dorothea's enthusiasm for cottage building on page 33. Didn't seem to see any reason for her to didn't want to encourage it, didn't want to help with it, didn't want to join in any way. 6, his letter, which is closer to a business proposal than a marriage proposal. Absolutely, there was no real spontaneous warmth or love in that. I mean, he used the word affection. I really don't know what that means, because, as I say, if she were a dog, people really do love their dogs, though. I don't want to insult dog owners by comparing them to Mr. Casaubon. That would be terrible. No. So let's just skip over that completely and go to the last point, of course, which is this chapter, how little feeling he can even muster during what would be, to me, the best period of any couple's time together. It's that period between, yes, we've agreed that we want to stay together, and marriage. And I'm sorry, I say that as someone who's been married for nearly 40 years. There are other stages to go through, okay? They're not necessarily bad, but they're not necessarily as bright and sunny and warm and pleasant and utopian as the period of time. Okay, just get me. If anybody's about to get married, please don't take that to be like, there's nothing but doom and disaster ahead. Although if you want to help out your own relationship, possibly reading Middlemarch is a bad idea. But if you're going to do it anyway, if you're brave, then probably your relationship is solid anyway and can withstand any kind of novel, right? Any kind of novel. I say that facetiously, right? So what do these two have in common emotionally, Dorothea and Mr. Casaubon? It's just like the only thing I think they have in common is moodiness, the tendency to have a kind of mood. Now, it'll be a different kind. Mr. Brooke tried to warn Dorothea. He said, in the previous chapter, he'd known Casaubon for 10 years. And then he hints that Casaubon is inclined to mope, okay, to withdraw from the world rather than take in what it has to offer. And I wish we knew Casaubon's backstory. I don't know if Eliot is going to provide this in Middlemarch. It would be good to understand why can't he engage emotionally? It suggests that there was some kind of formative trauma, humiliation, emotional deprivation that made him feel safer in this world full of dead voices he can choose to hear, but he doesn't have to conduct a conversation, voices that can't really argue with him. And Dorothea, as we know, she gets moody in her own way. She gets really bad-tempered if her world is constricted. So imagine you've got a person who naturally constricts their world when they're under stress, and a person who gets stressed when their world is constricted. Oh, yeah. Now we know Dorothea's backstory, so we just know how this is going to work. She's a person of above average ability at a time when women are presumed to be, never to be intellectually capable. And so all that Mr. Brooke can do when he talks to Mr. Casaubon is just say, you must teach my niece to take things more quietly, to stop feeling and needing and all this. And I think the problem is, if Mr. Casaubon takes this advice to heart, he's going to seem justified in his little withdrawals. If Dorothea shows a little too much emotion and he doesn't know how to handle it, how to respond, and he withdraws, he's going to think, well, I'm just doing what Mr. Brooke advised. Try to quiet Dorothea down. She just has way too much emotion than is good for her. There isn't a great deal more in this chapter that I felt was worthy to bring out. Except I noticed that Mr. Brooke, as he's leaving the library, it is wonderful, though, he said to himself as he shuffled out of the room, it is wonderful that she should have liked him. However, the match is good. I should have been... Now, it's funny that he says that afterwards. It's wonderful that she should have liked him. And then he says, however, the match is good. So he's not thinking that it matters that she likes him. And, of course, he goes on to say later on, he's pretty certain to be a bishop, is Casaubon. That was a very seasonable pamphlet on his... A deanery, at least. They owe him a deanery. And then Eliot, of course, or the narrator. Eliot's narrator breaks in to make their own comment. And here I must vindicate a claim to philosophical reflectiveness by remarking that Mr. Brooke on this occasion thought little of the radical speech which at a later period he was led to make on the incomes of the bishops. What elegant historian would neglect a striking opportunity for pointing out that his heroes did not foresee the history of the world or even their own actions? So in other words, what Mr. Brooke is saying now, being so happy that Dorothea has married a man who will have money, even though later he is going to seriously criticize the church and its money. Oh well, and I think he goes on to say here, but of Mr. Brooke, so I'm reading the last paragraph now, but of Mr. Brooke, I make a further remark, perhaps less warranted by precedent, namely, that if he had foreknown his speech, it might not have made any great difference. To think with pleasure of his niece's husband having a large ecclesiastical income was one thing. To make a liberal speech was another thing. Mr. Brooke is possibly a natural-born politician, because look how the narrator's telling us, he can make a very clean split between his principled speech that he makes about the pay that's being given to bishops. He can make a complete distinction between that and being happy that his niece is married to a man who will become a bishop and therefore she'll have lots of money. No, he can separate those two out in his mind. That is not a problem. And I thought, well, he'll do really, really well in politics, won't he? Very well. 2 thumbs up for Mr. Brooke as a politician. Tongue in cheek again, boys. Okay, does anybody think I'm serious now? No, you don't. No, you don't. You're all too smart for that. I know. Okay, everybody, that is the end of this Middlemarch meditation. Thanks for tuning in. Don't know when the next one is going to be. I try to make them about every 2 or 3 videos. I don't like you to wait too long for the next one. And so we'll go on then to chapter 8 and see what comes next. Okay, everyone, take care. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.